Garren Holt stood in the dim glow of his office, his fingers tracing the edge of a hunting knife, while Leora slept peacefully upstairs, unaware that tonight would be her last. Serafina and Elora, their innocent laughter still lingering in the air from earlier that evening, lay tucked in their beds, dreaming of a tomorrow that would never come. The perfect family, the perfect home. By morning, it would all be reduced to a crime scene, drenched in horror. Garren Holt was the kind of man everyone admired. Tall, confident and well-spoken, he carried himself with an air of success. He lived in a beautiful 2-story house with his wife, Leora, and their 2 daughters, Serafina and Elora. Their home sat on a peaceful suburban street, lined with manicured lawns, white picket fences, and families who exchanged polite smiles on their morning walks. To the outside world, the Holts were the definition of perfection: a loving husband, a devoted wife, and 2 beautiful daughters who always had their hair neatly brushed and their backpacks packed for school. Leora was the heart of their home. She was warm, caring, and had a way of making everyone feel special. She volunteered at Serafina's elementary school, baked cookies for the neighbors, and never forgot a birthday or anniversary. She had married Garren young, believing in the promise of a lifetime together. For years, she had been his biggest supporter, standing by him as he built his business from the ground up. When he succeeded, she celebrated him. When he struggled, she reassured him. Their daughters were their pride and joy. Serafina, 8 years old, was a bright, curious child with a love for drawing. She spent hours at the dining room table, sketching princesses, castles, and magical lands she dreamed up in her mind. Elora, just 5, was full of energy and always, trailing behind her big sister, eager to copy everything she did. She adored animals, collecting stuffed toys that filled her pink and white bedroom. At bedtime, she insisted on hugging each one before going to sleep. For years, Garren had worked tirelessly to maintain the life he had built. His business, a small financial consulting firm, had once been successful. He wore expensive suits, drove a luxury car, and took his family on vacations that filled their photo albums with memories of sandy beaches and mountain hikes. But behind the scenes, things had begun to unravel. His company was losing clients. The economy had taken a downturn, and one by one his investments were failing. He was drowning in debt, though he refused to admit it to anyone. The pressure mounted with each passing day. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, credit card balances soared, and late-night phone calls from collectors became more frequent. He was doing everything he could to keep up appearances, but the weight of his financial ruin pressed down on him like a vice. The thought of losing everything he had built was unbearable. He couldn't let his family see him as a failure. Leora noticed the change in him. He was more distant, his patience thinner. He no longer laughed as easily or joined their daughters at the table for dinner. She had always been able to reach him before, to soothe him when life became overwhelming. But this time was different. His eyes held something unfamiliar, something cold and detached. He started coming home later than usual, claiming he had meetings with clients that never seemed to bring any new income. He locked himself in his office, staring at numbers that refused to add up. When Leora tried to talk to him, he brushed her off, assuring her that everything was fine. The walls of their perfect home were starting to crack. One evening, Leora found Garren sitting in the dark, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly, his knuckles turned white. She hesitated before speaking, worried that the wrong words might set him off. When she gently placed her hand on his shoulder, he flinched, as if burned. He turned to her, his expression unreadable, and for the first time, a shiver ran down her spine. Something was wrong. Serafina and Elora remained blissfully unaware of the tension in their home. They still ran through the house in giggles, played with their toys, and curled up beside their mother for bedtime stories. They still believed their father was a hero, a man who would always protect them. But Garren was no longer the man they thought he was. His mind was slipping into a darkness that no one could see. The tension in the Holt household grew heavier with each passing day. Garren was no longer the man Leora had married. His once charismatic and confident demeanor had faded into something unsettling. He barely spoke at dinner, spent most of his nights locked away in his office, and avoided looking his wife in the eyes. When he did, there was no warmth in his gaze, only a distant, unreadable emptiness. Leora told herself it was just stress. She reminded herself that Garren had always been strong, that he would find a way through this, just like he always had. But, deep down, something in her was beginning to stir, an instinctual feeling she couldn't shake. It whispered that something was different this time, something was wrong. Garren's paranoia had taken root, and it was spreading like a wildfire. He convinced himself that Leora was keeping secrets from him. Late at night, while she slept beside him, he would reach for her phone, scrolling through her messages with shaky hands. He found nothing suspicious, but his mind twisted the most innocent conversations into evidence of betrayal. A message from an old college friend became a hidden affair in his mind. A casual chat with a neighbor was proof that she was planning to leave him. He imagined the whispers, the judging stares, the way people would look at him if his wife walked away. He couldn't allow it. His financial failures were already enough to break him, but the thought of losing his family was too much. He was convinced that Leora saw him as weak now, that she was planning to take Serafina and Alora away from him. The idea festered inside him, poisoning every interaction. When she asked him if he was okay, he saw it as an act, a performance, to mask her true intentions. When she suggested they seek help, he took it as an insult, a confirmation that she no longer respected him. He started watching her more closely, memorizing her routines, listening to her phone calls when she thought. He wasn't nearby. He imagined her speaking in hushed tones about him, telling someone that she was done, that she had already decided to leave. At night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his thoughts raced in endless circles, each one darker than the last. Leora noticed the small changes in his behavior, the way he stood in doorways, watching her without speaking, the way he gripped his fork at dinner, his knuckles turning pale, the way his breathing grew heavier when she entered the room. She tried to dismiss it, tried to believe that this was just another rough patch in their marriage, but the feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. One afternoon, while Serafina and Alora played outside, Leora sat at the kitchen table scrolling through job listings on her laptop. She wasn't planning to leave Garren, but she knew she needed some independence. If she could find a job, even something small, it might ease the financial strain and bring some stability back into their lives. Garren walked in at that moment, his eyes darting to the screen. In an instant, his mind twisted what he saw into something sinister. To him, she wasn't looking for work, she was planning her escape. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short bursts. He clenched his fists at his sides, willing himself to stay calm. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in his office, staring at the wall, his mind a storm of anger and fear. He imagined Leora taking their daughters and walking out the door. He imagined her telling them that their father was a failure, that they were better off without him. The images played in his mind over and over again, growing more vivid, more unbearable. He wouldn't let it happen. He had given everything to this family. He had built this life from nothing, and he would not let it slip away. If Leora wanted to leave, she wouldn't get the chance. If she thought she could take Serafina and Alora from him, she was wrong. In his mind, he had already made his decision. There was only one way to make sure his family stayed together forever. The night was eerily quiet inside the Holt household. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound that filled the silence. Outside, the neighborhood was still, the warm glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the perfectly trimmed lawns. Inside his darkened office, Garren sat motionless, his fingers tapping against the wooden desk. His mind was a tangled mess of thoughts, spiraling deeper into paranoia with each passing hour. He had convinced himself that Leora was planning to leave the next day. The evidence was everywhere. Or at least, that's what his mind told him. The job searches, the distant looks, the hushed phone calls. He imagined the scene in vivid detail, her packing bags in secret, whispering to their daughters that they had to leave before morning. The idea sent a surge of rage through his body. He had built this life, and he would not let her tear it apart. His grip tightened around the small hunting knife he had pulled from his desk drawer. He had bought it years ago for camping trips with his family, back when things were good. Now it felt cold and heavy in his hand, a symbol of the irreversible path he had chosen. Slowly, he rose from his chair and stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. The house was filled with an unnatural stillness, the kind that made the air feel thick, suffocating. He moved past the living room, past the photos hanging on the wall, memories of happier times, moments frozen in time that no longer felt real. He stopped at the door to the master bedroom, his breath shallow, his pulse thudding. In his ears, Leora was asleep, her body curled under the blankets, unaware of the danger lurking just feet away. Garren's grip on the knife tightened as he took a slow step forward. The thought of her leaving, of her turning their daughters against him, fueled his every movement. He convinced himself that this was the only way, that if he couldn't have his family, no one could. The first strike was quick, slicing through the silence with a sickening finality. Leora's body jerked awake, but she had no time to react, before another blow followed. Her hands clutched at the sheets, struggling, but the fight was over before it had even begun. The woman who had once been his partner, his greatest supporter, lay still beneath him, the life draining from her, as the room filled with an unbearable quiet. For a brief moment, the weight of what he had done settled over him. His breathing was heavy, erratic, but there was no turning back now. The job wasn't finished. The next door he opened was to Serafina's room. She lay peacefully in her bed, her long hair spread across the pillow, lost in dreams of castles and fairy tales. Garren hesitated for a moment, a flicker of something, guilt, regret, passing through his mind. But then he remembered his twisted reasoning, his belief that this was mercy, that this was how he kept them together. He raised the knife once more. Elora was next. The youngest, the one who still carried a stuffed animal wherever she went. The one who giggled at everything, who had just started learning how to write her name. She stirred slightly as he entered, but her small body remained still, trusting, unaware. By the time it was done, the house felt different. The warmth was gone, replaced by an overwhelming emptiness. Garren stood in the hallway, his breathing shallow, his hands trembling. The silence was suffocating, but in his mind, the chaos was finally over. The family would never be separated now. They would never leave him. The house was eerily quiet, the weight of what had just transpired settling into the walls like an invisible force. The air felt heavier, suffocating, as if the house itself understood the horror that had unfolded within its walls. Garren stood, in the hallway, his body trembling, his hands stained with the irreversible proof of what he had done. His mind was numb, disconnected from reality, as though he were watching himself from somewhere far away. The stillness in the house was unnatural. It was the kind of silence that didn't belong in a home filled with the laughter of children, the gentle hum of a mother's voice. That laughter would never fill these walls again. That voice would never speak another word. Garren had made sure of it. For a long time, he didn't move. His breathing was shallow, his heart pounding so loudly in his ears that it drowned out everything else. He expected to feel something, relief maybe, or even satisfaction. But instead, a hollow emptiness gnawed at his insides. He had told himself that this was the only way, that if he couldn't keep his family together in life, he would in death. But now, standing in the midst of his irreversible destruction, he felt nothing but a strange, sinking realization. This was not what he had imagined. The weight of silence became unbearable. He turned away from the bedroom doors, forcing himself to move, to do something, anything. His hands shook as he stumbled down the stairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath his unsteady feet. His mind was fractured, flipping between moments of distorted clarity and complete detachment. His eyes landed on the family photo resting on the living room shelf, the four of them, smiling, frozen in time. Leora's warm eyes, Serafina's bright, excited grin, Elora's tiny hands clutching her father's arm, a perfect image of the life he had destroyed. He reached for the frame, his fingers trembling as they traced over the glass. The weight of what he had done crashed over him like a tidal wave. What had he become? He let out a shuddering breath and forced himself to think. He had planned this, hadn't he? He couldn't afford to break down now. If he lost control, everything would fall apart. He needed to make this look like something else, something that wasn't his fault. His mind scrambled for a plan, but his thoughts were a chaotic mess, a break-in. Yes, that made sense. Someone had entered the home, taken his family from him, left him alone to suffer. He could be the grieving husband, the devastated father. No one would suspect him, not at first at least. His movements became mechanical as he set the stage. He overturned furniture, pulled drawers from their slots, scattered belongings across the floor. It needed to look real. It needed to look like someone else had done this. He moved from room to room, careful to make it chaotic, but not too deliberate. He knocked over the lamp in the hallway, shattered the glass of the back door. The sound echoed through the empty house, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence. He needed an alibi. His gaze flickered to the clock. It was late, but not too late. He grabbed his keys, wiped his hands clean, and forced himself to step outside. The night air was crisp against his skin, grounding him in the reality of what he had done. He climbed into his car and drove, his mind spinning as he rehearsed the story he would tell. A late-night drive to clear his mind. He had come home to a nightmare. It was the only way to save himself. The flashing red and blue lights painted the Holt house in a chaotic swirl of colour. Officers moved in and out of the home, their faces grim, their voices low as they discussed the scene inside. The neighbours had gathered in clusters along the sidewalk, whispering in hushed tones, their faces reflecting a mix of shock and horror. Nothing like this had ever happened in their quiet neighbourhood. The idea that such darkness could exist within the walls of the Holt home felt impossible, yet the undeniable reality lay just beyond the yellow crime scene tape. Garren stood outside, his face buried in his hands, his body trembling. He had made sure to look the part of a grieving husband and father, his shirt wrinkled, his breathing uneven, his eyes red as if he had been crying for hours. The officers asked him questions, their voices gentle at first, as if they were afraid. He might break at any moment. He told them exactly what he had rehearsed in his mind during his drive. He had gone out for a late-night drive, unable to sleep, needing air to clear his thoughts. He had been gone for hours, aimlessly driving through town. When he returned home, he found the back door shattered. He walked inside and discovered the unthinkable. His wife and daughters were gone. His voice cracked at the right moments. His hands shook as he described the horror of what he had found. He forced himself to collapse into a chair, burying his face in his palms as if he couldn't bear to relive it again. The officers exchanged glances, some taking notes, others observing his every movement. For a while, it seemed to work. Detectives combed through the house, noting the forced entry, the overturned furniture. The crime scene technicians moved carefully, documenting every detail, collecting evidence. From the outside, it looked like a brutal home invasion, a senseless act of violence. But as the hours passed, as the sun crept closer to the horizon, the air around the investigation began to shift. The detectives started asking different questions. There was no sign of a struggle. Leora had been found in bed, the blankets still, covering her body. Serafina and Elora had been tucked in, as if they had gone to sleep without any fear, There was no sign of forced entry beyond the broken back door, and nothing valuable had been taken. It was staged, too neat, too controlled. The pieces weren't fitting together the way they should. The forensic team examined Garren closely. His hands, his clothes, his car. They found traces of blood beneath his fingernails, despite his careful attempts to scrub them clean. The knife, hastily washed and placed back in the drawer, still carried microscopic evidence. The crime scene spoke louder than Garren's carefully crafted words. By midday, the officers no longer looked at him with sympathy. Their eyes were colder, sharper. The questioning became more direct. Where had he really gone? Why was there no surveillance footage of his car leaving the neighborhood? Why was there no sign of forced entry beyond the staged break-in? Garren's rehearsed grief started to falter. The pressure tightened around him like a vice, the weight of his own lies suffocating. When the detective placed a firm hand on his shoulder and told him he needed to come to the station for further questioning, he knew. It was over. The world had collapsed around him, but not in the way he had expected. He had thought he could control everything, manipulate the truth, twist reality to fit his own story. But the truth had found its way to the surface, just as it always did. As they placed him in handcuffs and led him away, the house stood still. Behind him, silent, empty, haunted by the family he had destroyed.